Hello everybody and welcome to video 3 in our Cinema 4D Lite series, Animating Objects and Groups. We've taken a tour of the interface, we've modeled a lovely little scene, and now we're going to set things in motion. If you're coming from After Effects or Flash or other programs that use keyframes, many of the concepts will be familiar. But if not, don't worry, I'll be explaining everything along the way. If you've not watched and followed along with the previous videos in the series, I recommend that you do, because there are concepts and terms in those that will help you understand this video better. And if you don't have anything to animate, please use the links in the description to grab project files to follow along. I've divided this course into different videos, and each video is divided into chapters, so please make use of those in the description below if you need to jump around. If you have questions about what you see in this video, please do let me know in the comments so I can help you out. Also, a big thanks to MSI for providing their lovely hardware. You'll see me working on this Creator Z17 throughout the series. If you're interested in picking up one of those of your own, please use the link in the description and see what they have to offer. Now let's move on and make things move in Cinema 4D Lite. Well, how do we make things move and change over time in Cinema 4D? Well, the first thing to remember is that everything is defined by attributes. This one pawn is defined as being at a certain place on the X, Y, and Z axes. So if I wanted it to be here at one moment and then over there at another, I'm making a change to the coordinates attribute. The thing we use to make this change over time is the keyframe. I like to think of keyframes as appointments for attributes that say what value they should have at a certain time. So in this case, I will click the little diamond next to the attribute that I want to set a keyframe for, and you can see it turns red. That means there is a keyframe at this time at this value. Now I will scrub ahead to a future time using the timeline and then change the value in the attribute. You can see that the diamond is now orange, telling me that I've changed the value from a previously keyed one. If I want to set a keyframe at this time at this value, I should click the little diamond again, setting the new value at this new time. It's really important to remember that any property can have a keyframe on it. Anything you see with this little diamond next to it can hold keyframes and therefore can be animated over time. Now, since we have this pawn moving forward, maybe I want to set keyframes to make it go up, like someone is picking it up. So I'll set keyframes on the Y position as well, scrub through, move the pawn up, set the keyframe, keep scrubbing, bring it back down, set the keyframe, and now we have the pawn making some admittedly not superb movements. We might also layer in some animation of the rotation as it's being moved. So I'll scrub to where I want the change in rotation to start, click the diamond, scrub to when I want the values to be something different, change those attributes, click the diamond, scrub, change, click. And look at this, things are starting to shape up. We're getting a little bit more nuance in the movement here. I'll press the play button so we can enjoy watching it back while I just mention that it is admittedly a lot of clicks to get where we want things to be. And while I've been changing the values over in the Attributes Manager, we could have used the Move and Rotate tools as well, because those are just a visual way of changing the values of attributes. At this point, it would be helpful to know what is happening when we set the keys, where are they being set, and how can we change them after we've set them. We can expand our timeline to look at what we call the dope sheet by clicking the little diamond over in the corner. This is a space where all the attributes that we have set keyframes on will be represented in a little hierarchy over at the side, and the keyframes will be spread out almost like sheet music across times, these little rectangles. You'll see me zoom in and pan over the timeline very quickly here. That's thanks to the keyboard shortcuts that we covered in video 1 of the series. Holding 1 and 2 on your keyboard while clicking and dragging will get you zooming and panning in any interface window you find in this app. Each row is what we would call a track, and each attribute becomes a track like in an editing program or audio mixer. And you can see that some of these become nested inside each other. So this is a group for the pawn, and that can be expanded to show the folders for position, scale, rotation, and within those we can expand them to see the individual attribute tracks. If you want to give any attribute its own track, you can right-click on any attribute that you find and just go down to Add Track. This will prime that attribute to receive keyframes because it now has a track on the dope sheet. So once an attribute has a track, we can navigate to it and while holding Control, click a frame on the track to add keyframes to it. And of course, we can always modify these keys after they've been set. Clicking on any keyframe will open it up in the Attribute Manager where you can see the precise value and frame number of that keyframe. We could modify those things directly in the attribute manager by changing their values, but we can also change them right in the dope sheet. Click and drag to move any keyframe around. Anything that is highlighted in this solid orange is going to be moved when you do that. We can actually move large groups that are all at the same time by clicking on the rectangle above the stack of keys and dragging them about. This is where you're going to be happy to have a larger screen for this timeline window. Having the space to see more of our keyframes makes working with them much easier, so I'm really enjoying this golden ratio monitor for that. You can also click and drag selections or select entire tracks to grab many keyframes all at once, and then we can slide them by hovering over the middle of the span, clicking there and moving that. We can also stretch and squish the span by dragging an end, effectively scaling that span over time. This is a great way to modify many keyframes at once. For example, all the movements we did for this pawn. I can select the pawn group and then stretch or compress the keys, sliding them around as a big unit. This really helps us to stay organized. To change a key's value, you need only double-click on it. That will open up the value, type in a new one, hit return, and that value has been updated. This way, you don't need to come over to the attribute manager every time you want to granularly change something. If you find the timeline is getting really cluttered, if you have too many tracks, I recommend that you use this little button here, the Only Object Manager Selection, which will only show you animated tracks on the things you have selected in the Object Manager. It is a lifesaver on larger, more complex projects. And speaking of complexity, let's go one level deeper into these keyframes. Keyframes don't just say when an attribute should be a certain value, they also say how we get to that value and then how we leave it. Back in the dope sheet, I'm going to twirl one more level down into one of these properties, and we are greeted with a lovely Bezier curve. Selecting either or both of the keyframes on the ends will reveal the influence handle of that curve. This is going to show us how the value will arrive and then leave this keyframe if we were to extend that appointment analogy from earlier. By default, these are Bezier or eased. That makes for a smooth transition in and out of each value as they plateau to that value. We can always change that to be linear, and as you can see, that changes the quality of the motion. You might also change it to be step, which is sometimes called a hold keyframe in other apps. And you can see that that is like having no interpolation at all between the keys. To get a better view of these motion curves, let's look at the F-curve view using this toggle button. This is similar to the dope sheet, but instead it displays only the curves. It can be harder to work with timing and duration, but for manipulating the nuance of how we get from one thing to another, it's really hard to beat this view. If you're coming from After Effects, this will look a lot like the graph editor, and it behaves exactly like a value graph because it is indeed graphing value over time. We can grab the handles and move the tangents around manually to get some really fine control over the shape. And when moving those handles around, you can hold Shift to break a linked set of handles apart. You can hold Control to maintain the angle, but only change the length. And you could hold Alt to keep the length and only change the angle. And you can always use the more automated bulk changes up here on the top of the timeline. Easing or softening the curve with these buttons is a really quick way to get nice, smooth transitions of value. If you need more precision, we can do fine manipulations of the tangents in the attribute panel, typing in whatever values we might want or just clicking and dragging on the value to slide it around. In this example of the pawn moving, I'm going to tweak the handles to give a bit more of a feeling of hang time at the apex of the movement, and we're going to get the rotation to be a little bit more extreme. This is where a lot of the nuance and creativity of movement comes from. Something to remember when looking at this value graph: the more horizontal the line is, the less change over time we're seeing, and the more vertical that a line is, the more extreme of a change it is. Hopefully all of these technical details will give you a good foundation so you can get your keyframes doing exactly what you want. Now, I think you can see that this is a lot of clicking around to make things move the way we want. There can be a lot of labor involved in animating, laying things back, moving, updating values, updating curves, getting things just so. Well, here are some tips that might help make that a little bit faster and a little bit more enjoyable. First, I want to call your attention to these red buttons on the timeline. These are to set automatic recording of keyframes. The first set of these buttons, if pressed, is going to set keys on the position, scale, and rotation of whatever you have selected. Very helpful if you need to set all of those at once. Holding down on it will swap out the button for either setting keys on just the animated properties, which would be anything that you've added to the dope sheet already or set a previous key on. And the final option is just to delete all of the keys on that object at this time. Next to that is the Record Automatic Keyframes button. If you've got keys on properties and you turn this option on, and we know it's on because the frame goes red, we'll be setting keyframes whenever a property is modified. This can really speed us up, but can also lead to more keys being made than you might need. So I'd recommend getting into this only once you're comfortable with how all of these systems work. And remember, we can always come back later and modify our curves and timing. So this recording option is sometimes just used for a first pass on our motion. And that brings me into tip number 2, which is that we will have to play back our animation many times, refining it, making choices, making changes. So understanding these playback controls is really going to help. All these first controls are just play, pause, frame forward, first, last. These are normal, just like you'd find on a VCR, I guess. The next ones are the odd ones. First, we see how things will play. Right now it's set to cycle, so it's going to play through again and again. But click and hold on this and you could choose ping pong, which will be playing forward and then backwards. This is great for if you're trying to work out character animation and trying to make things seem smooth. And the last option is just playing it through once and then hard stopping. You might want to do that if you need to make significant changes between passes. At the bottom, we have the option to choose what duration we are playing. Usually this is set to the preview region, which is defined by the gray bar down at the bottom. I can pinch that in so we're only looking at certain frames. This is what we want to do when we're trying to work on a really specific part of our animation. Lock it into just that part. Next, we have our playback frame rate and the option to show all frames or not. If you're experiencing slow playback, we can uncheck this to drop frames in favor of maintaining the speed of the playback. We could also specify slower and faster frame rates, though we tend to just use the project's frame rate when previewing. Now, my last tip is also about performance. I'm using an MSI machine to record this lesson, so I'm able to access the MSI Control Center and optimize the performance of this machine. This allows me to get a lot of performance boosts out of my hardware when I need it by selecting Smart Auto to let the machine detect which resources are specifically needed at whatever time. Though I will say I tend to work this in high performance mode whenever I'm animating, but I could also move this into Smart Priority and allow an AI to balance the demands of the system. Here's an animated example file that uses all the functions we cover in the lesson. As we pile on more and more animations, more polygons, more lighting, more whatever, more things are being calculated and changed. So we're asking the hardware to do more, and it's recommended that you eke out whatever optimizations you can wherever possible to ensure you're getting smooth playback, so the thing that we're looking at represents the thing that it actually is when we hit render. And speaking of getting many things in motion, let's take a look now at animating large groups of things without having to set large groups of keyframes. This is actually one of my favorite parts of Cinema 4D. And while we only have a little sliver of the power that's available in the full version, I think you're going to like what we can do here. In this example, you can see we have all of these tiles that make up the surface of the chessboard, and they're all lifting up and turning with one change to one object. Many other objects are responding to it. This is the power of the MoGraph module. And while we only get a little sliver of its power in the Lite version, this is a great system to understand. To make use of this, we need a MoGraph generator, and the one that we have access to is called the fracture. You might think that this would break an object apart, it would explode it, and you're not wrong in expecting that, but it's not quite that simple. To show you how this works, I'm going to place all of the chessboard tiles into the fracture. This will let us make a change to the entire group by changing things about the fracture object. We then need to affect this group, so we need to add an effector. We have access to two, the best two in my opinion, being the plane and the random. And let's start with the plane effector. With the fracture selected, if we add the plane to the scene, then the plane effector is added into the list of effectors enacting on the fracture system. Otherwise, we just have to add it to this list by dragging it in or picking it with the eyedropper. And as you can see, this plane effector has now caused a change in the group. Going into the parameter of the plane, we can see exactly what. Everything is just being moved by 100 units. Whoop-de-doo, you might say. I could move a group up to 100 units. That is nothing special. But the interesting part happens when we say which elements are going to be affected and by how much. Here in the Fields tab, I will add a spherical field, and already there's something interesting happening. You can see that only pieces of the fracture that overlap with the core of this field are being pushed up. Anything between the inner and outer sphere is being pushed up a little bit. And outside of the outside sphere, nothing is being pushed at all. As I move it around, you can see an update to who is being pushed and by how much. Here I'm going to move the field down. I'm just going to animate it getting larger. I'm going to change its size over time, just as we did in the first part of the video with keyframes. Watching that back, you can see now it's growing, pushing everything up. We might change that parameter to be higher, so that's looking better, getting a lot more lift out of these. And we might want to change this fall off, the middle range. Right now, the fall off is set to linear, and I would like that to be a curve so we get a smoother transition from inside to outside of the sphere. And you can change this to all kinds of shapes, custom shapes, curved shapes, whatever you like. We have total control over this thing. And for even more nuanced control, we can also just add multiple fields and combine them. Maybe one field is going to add and the other one is going to take away. So I'm going to set it to subtract and animate it to come in a little bit later. So we now have two fields interacting to say which things should be pushed and by how much. The plane effector could also rotate or scale or offset the various members of the generator in time, but the thing to remember is that it's applying a change to everybody, and then we limit who gets that change with a field and by how much. And with just those two ideas, there's a lot to explore, there's a lot to be made, and I hope you enjoy playing around with them. But the other effector we have access to is the random. So if the plane is giving everyone the same change, the random is giving everyone a slightly different change. And we can shape what that looks like too. I'm going to add a random effector to the system and have it give a random rotation and introduce some Y position change. But again, I don't want this to happen to everybody. How much of this effector is affecting each part of the system can be controlled again with fields, and why not just use the same fields as before? I will simply add both of those already excellent fields into the random effectors system and make sure that they're adding and subtracting just like before. And now look at this. As the field moves through, things are going up, they're getting random, then they're coming back down in a cool wave. Like I said, there's a lot we can do with just these two effectors and the very limited set of fields we have. And this is just a tiny taste, a soupçon of what the MoGraph module could do. But I hope this kind of explains how you can get started applying it to systems of your own. Now, there are many things we might put into this system. Large piles of objects is just one of them. Here I have a text spline that I've extruded to make 3D lovely text. If I put that into a fracture, we would hope that each letter is going to go somewhere when I drop in a random effector. But no. We have to change how that fracture is looking at what's inside it, and we need to change that specifically to be segments. Now each segment of the text will be fractured individually, and each character in this case is considered a segment. We can even do this with just geometry. Here, I'll replace that text with a cube inside the same fracture. Assessing things by segment is turned on, and once I check inside the cube, letting it know that the sides should all be treated as separate segments, now each face is being treated as the thing that should be fractured away from each other. Similarly, if we drop an array into the fracture object, you're going to see all the different things being arrayed around are what are fracturing apart, because each part of the array is considered a different segment. So hopefully you can see that we can get a lot of mileage out of this one single part of the MoGraph module in the fracture object. Now, all of these methods so far are just variations on a theme, setting keyframes on properties. Surely that's not the only way. Well, you're right. In Cinema 4D, we have other drivers of movement or change that we can access. The first one I want to talk about is the vibrate tag. We can apply it in the object manager by right-clicking on a thing, going into the animation tags, and selecting vibrate. That will start to move an object with no keyframes required. I'm going to enable position and just press play, and we're having a great time now. If you're coming from After Effects, this is really similar to how the wiggle expression would work, using noise to drive a random change in a property. We can up the frequency, increase the range of the value that it's going to be changing within, and maybe add in scale and rotation changes as well. This is great if you need something that just has to waggle and undulate about. If you would like a more controlled change, click on regular pulse. Now you can see a much more chill movement oscillating through the values. This is great if you need some repeated, regular oscillations of a thing. Now, speaking of noise and randomness, anytime we see randomness in this app, we can animate it, depending on the type of randomness being used. Let's revisit that random effector as applied to this fracture of tiles. and we'll look specifically at the Effector tab where we see the Random mode. Here we can choose another mode, like Noise or Turbulence, and we'll be greeted with an animation attribute. I'll press play here so you can see the thing going through the motions, and we can dial this up and down as we like. The noise evolves over time to produce this random movement, but it's not totally random. There is a method to the madness that can produce smooth changes from one value to the next. We could scale that noise pattern up and down, and you can see that that makes for neighboring elements that are more or less similar to each other as we make that noise larger and smaller. If that's what you'd like to see your objects do, remember that anything that says random or noise can be animated in this way. For example, we have access to the random field, which, as you can see here, has similar options. A few other procedural animation options can be found in the deformers bin. We have the formula and wind deformers in here. They aren't particularly germane to this chess scene, so I'll just apply them to a plane so you can see what they're doing. The formula deformer is going to deform a surface using a mathematical formula. And if you're keen on maths, you might want to play around with that. For this video, I'll just say that a full list of all the variables are available to us in the Cinema 4D help function. By default, it's pushing a wave function through whatever you apply it to. There's a lot of complex things going on in here. We won't dwell on it too much. But speaking of waves, how about some wind, which is like waves through the sky? This is very similar because it is deforming a surface with similar properties for frequency, amplitude, turbulence, concepts that we've seen in randomness. We've seen it in the vibrate tag. So if you need something to appear like it's flapping in the wind, give this a go. And speaking of flapping, I think that's enough out of me for now. I hope you've enjoyed learning about the animation tools available to us in Cinema 4D Lite. Everything you've seen here that we've talked about was used to make this lovely scene that we're observing here at the end. And if you want to download that scene and find out how all those little bits come together, please use the link in the description to get a hold of that. You'll also find links in the description to just the chess set if you want to start fresh and animate it all by yourself. We're going to be using these same assets in our next part of the series, covering materials, lights, and cameras, all the things we're going to need to make the scene visible and beautiful. But until that time, stay creative, be kind to each other, and I'll see you all around the internet.